There's a book coming out next week called The Deep Places, a Memoir of Illness and Discovery by Ross Douthat. We were sent an advance copy, and it's excellent. I recommend it. It's not available quite yet. I think it's coming out on Tuesday. And it's really quite surprising. It is nominally, as I've just read the subtitle as well as the title, a memoir of illness and discovery. Douthat is a New York Times columnist, and this is a different sort of book for him. He finds himself sick, not getting better, with symptoms that are extreme, but which no doctor is able to diagnose. He's referred to psychologists. Of course, even his family is wondering if it's in his head. As Douthat says in the book, in the first year or two, as he's hoping against hope for a treatment that works and occasionally gets blips, an hour or two, maybe even a day or two in which he's feeling better, he says, the feeling better moments never held, and I kept falling back into the pain and dark. And anyone who's experienced either chronic illness or deep physical trauma that took a very long time to heal or is not completely healing will recognize that sense of falling back into the pain and dark. And of course, it's also true that ongoing pain and illness is not just hard to take for the other people in your life. One of the hardest things for the person experiencing it is the realization that it's fundamentally boring for the other people in your life. It's boring for you too, of course, but Douthat reports that he would run into people or see people online that he hadn't seen in many months or even a couple of years, and they would be surprised, like, "Wait, you're still dealing with that?" There's a disappointment, and indeed a sense that somehow you must be doing this to yourself, or that you're exaggerating, and that's not helpful when you're experiencing something that you can't control, you can't diagnose, no one is diagnosing for you, and you're just miserable to be met also with the disappointment and, yes, boredom of those who love you. So that's one of the themes running through the book, and it's quite remarkably well done. And here's a spoiler, but not really, because it emerges very early in the book. It turns out that Douthat has still Lyme disease. And there's a lot to say here, but for me, the book really gets interesting. Well, actually, I'm going to read a few short passages. Early in the book, without any more introduction, I will say also, I have the advance uncorrected proofs. They're sending me the final book. I don't have it yet, so it's possible this isn't exactly what's in the final book, but it's quite good. The consensus around Lyme disease was sealed in 1991, when there were enough new reported cases, 10,000 and climbing, for the Centers for Disease Control to begin national surveillance for Lyme, establish formal diagnostic criteria, and endorse a 2-tier testing regimen, the ELISA test followed by the Western blot, 2 different ways of looking for Lyme antibodies in the patient's blood. Diagnostic standardization was supposed to establish a consistent baseline for national case reporting, not rule out the possibility of atypical cases or constrain doctors from diagnosing them. But in practice, it did exactly that, narrowing the range of cases that counted as real Lyme by encouraging doctors to limit their diagnoses to a CDC-approved set of symptoms, mostly visible manifestations like joint swelling and the famous rash. Meanwhile, the testing rules had a similar effect. The 2-tier approach reduced the risk of false positives, but it created a larger chance of false negatives, missing anywhere from a third to half of early Lyme cases, and as many as 25% of cases even in late-stage neurologic Lyme. The incentive structures forged by the CDC were a fascinating case study in how bureaucracy shapes science as much as the other way around. How without any conscious decision, let alone conspiracy, scientific research can end up pushed again and again down the same well-worn tracks. The narrow diagnostic criteria became the benchmark not just for doctors treating patients, but for researchers when they applied for public grants, so that Lyme research increasingly focused on only the most certain diagnoses and left all ambiguous cases and potential false negatives alone. This approach ratified the establishment's confidence in their own rules of evidence. A study might show that most Lyme patients had the typical presentations, clear blood tests, consistent early symptoms, but only after making one or more of these presentations a prerequisite for being admitted to the study in the first place. Likewise, after 1991, insurance companies began to deny payment for Lyme cases that didn't meet the CDC criteria. If you were a doctor who wanted to diagnose or treat more broadly, you basically had to become a medical outsider, a maverick, the sort of weird specialist who didn't take insurance, who risked scrutiny from state medical boards, and so on down a list of attributes that self-selected for eccentricity, stubbornness, and a touch of crankery. So the CDC guidelines essentially ratified the split already opening in the 1980s between an official understanding of the disease and a dissenting view, between a medical establishment that felt satisfied with how it diagnosed and treated this novel-seeming pathogen and a growing population of patients and sufferers, or self-described sufferers at least, who felt ignored, abandoned, and betrayed. It created not just two worldviews, but two cultures, two concentric circles of insiders and outsiders, the inner one confident and authoritative and buoyed by institutional support, the outer one more fluid and open-minded, but also necessarily more peculiar and paranoid and sometimes frankly gonzo in its theories and experiments. There are even two different medical associations. The Infectious Diseases Society of America issued the mainstream guidelines, while the dissenters formed the International Lyme and Associated Diseases Society, which issued recommendations of its own. Let me read the few other excerpts before we talk about this. So I'll say I read the book and you have not read it, but I've been talking to you about it as I've been reading it. Much later in the book, I won't say what page it is because I'm not sure the pages will be consistent between my version and the published version. Just this: a data set can be meaningful and useful and suggestive, in other words, even if it falls short of the standards that are set by official medicine in its bureaucratized, safety-first contemporary form. Then this. Let me offer a note of optimism. If there is one thing that makes the chronic Lyme world different from other realms of alternative or outsider medicine, it's the centrality of antibiotics, a paradigmatic, insider-approved treatment to its preferred cure. Often in medical debates, the pattern is reversed. The established recommends antibiotics, the outsiders and mavericks worry that they're overprescribed, the holistic types warn about their side effects. But with Lyme, it's the establishment that retreats to mystery, while the dissenters are yelling about how we already have the necessary drugs. 3 more. So at the end of the book, I had reached out to the publisher to ask if it would be okay if I would talk about this, as I didn't imagine that the author was going to talk about COVID at all, given I just didn't see any evidence of it. And I wanted to make some connections to our current environment. And it turns out he does. And it turns out he got COVID. And he and his son took the tests, and his son's test was botched and therefore was inconclusive, while his was negative. He says, a past version of myself might have been tempted to believe the result. The new version, the one accustomed to inconclusive tests and self-doctoring, considered my distinctive symptoms, plus my family's distinctive symptoms, plus the timing, plus the fact that tests at that point had at least a 40% false negative rate, and felt entirely comfortable with self-diagnosis. On and on and on. He uses a number of the alternative treatments to which he feels that he's been forced and now is finding some relief in with regard to Lyme, to try for his COVID. And he says, and long before it was picked up by Donald Trump, back when it was just an internet theory based on French and Chinese trials, I knew all about hydroxychloroquine, which had been prescribed to me by the reassurer, his pseudonym for one of his doctors, long ago in a bottle that still had a few pills remaining, which I now found and took. And he took a few things. He doesn't know what worked, but he knows he got better very fast. 2 more sentences, 2 more very brief excerpts. From the beginning of the pandemic to its still unfinished end, there were weirdos on the internet, that's us, who were more reliable guides to what was happening, what was possible, and what should actually be done than Anthony Fauci or any other official information source. And finally, on nearly the last page of the book, very near the end of the book, it's completely understandable that the medical establishment doesn't want to officially endorse any of the various unproven paths. But there's a difference between declining to endorse a single path and ruling further treatment out entirely. A difference between acknowledging the diversity of case studies and claiming that no lessons can be drawn from the diverse attempts to treat them.
Wow. No shortage of lessons here.
No shortage of lessons. And so you see why I think I had just finished it at the point that we were on air last week. And I was thinking so much about the lessons that we can learn from how Lyme, we had students with long Lyme, which is now how I've come to think of it, long Lyme, long COVID, which Douthat clearly has. And, like with COVID, very many people are asymptomatic, and very many other people actually follow the CDC mainstream, course of symptoms and get better quickly, and some number of people don't. And the idea that those people are therefore making things up or shouldn't be trying other things or should be forced into the fringes of the medical establishment, and often forced, therefore, in the U.S., because of our crappy healthcare system, our crappy insurance system, forced to pay out of pocket in their attempts to do things that will that in some cases, he reports, helped him, even though there is no, there are no RCTs for many of these treatments, right? There's not even published research for some of them. And yet there's a whole internet of people who find evidence that things work. And indeed, he found some things that worked and some things that didn't. And part of the welcome to complex systems, some things will work for some people and they will not work for others. And that is to be expected.
Yeah, this is exactly what I was going to say, is that this is actually, even if we just look at an honorable, smart system trying to do the right thing, there's a fundamental problem at the ground floor here, which is very difficult to solve, which is, let's say, so first of all, we should distinguish between a pathology and a syndrome, right? A pathology is an actual mechanistic description of how something goes wrong. A syndrome is a list of symptoms that seem to go along with something. And so very often, let's say that there's a pathogen circulating, but we haven't seen it yet, it's very hard to isolate a pathogen. And if you isolate a pathogen, it's very hard to know if it's a co-traveler with something that's causing a disease, whether it is causing the disease, right? These are famously hard things to establish. So you very often have a list of symptoms that doctors start to notice showing up together. And then there's a question about what might be causing it. And actually, you and I will remember back when AIDS had been spotted, but HIV was unknown, there was a huge, very strange at the time effort to figure out what it was. Were gay men doing something? Were they encountering some chemical? Right? Was something involved in
was it
gay
in the bathhouses?
Sex? Right. What was it? Right. We didn't know. And, and even after HIV was discovered, even from very respectable people like Carrie Mullis, there was a question about whether HIV was actually causal of the disease AIDS or was just simply correlated with it or something else. But nonetheless, the point is, humans are complex. Immune systems are complex. People get dysfunction of all kinds of origins, right? You can have a defective gene and it can cause a cascade of things to fail downstream of it. And you may therefore look like you have the same disease as somebody who has a pathology that has interrupted the same pathway, right? So
indeed,
the point is, when do, a doctor noticing a set of symptoms that go together might be looking at two diseases. Two doctors that see the same list of symptoms now have something, the basis of what might be a pattern. It could also be a total coincidence. Once you start recognizing these things, people who have mysterious ailments may spot the list of symptoms that overlaps what they have and discount the other ones because they want someone to pay attention to their problem. So it becomes necessary to set out a set of criteria to say, actually, these are the people who have the thing that we're trying to study and understand, and these people have something else, right? But then once you set that up, as Douthat points out, you now have a circular problem, which is you're including only people who have the established list in your study sample. And that means that to the extent there's something you need to learn from the people who have, 3 extra symptoms or 2 fewer symptoms, you won't learn it.
This is the problem with throwing out, this is the problem with the very concept of outliers at some level. And, we're not, and Douthat's argument and yours and ours before has been, actually, it's not even, there's one crazy erroneous case. Like I'm looking at a data set and it's got thousands and there's, a few things that are so far outside that we're just not going to pay attention to those. It's that so often the borders of our categories are drawn too early and somewhat arbitrarily. And the idea that, for instance, yes, you had Lyme, but if you still have Lyme 6 months later, then it's something else, even though your symptoms are the same. That alone is a very crazy declaration, and that apparently is something that both Douthat and other people with long Lyme experience. Like, oh yes, we will acknowledge that you had it, but given that it's gone on far longer than we recognize Lyme ever lasts, therefore you now have something that we're calling sort of post Lyme syndrome, or I don't remember exactly what it's called, but which is itself a rather remarkable declaration.
I don't even know that it is, though. actually, because we are always, in the case of a pathogen that causes a disease, we are always dealing with an arms race where the pathogen and the immune system duke it out. And the point is, there are certain canonical strategies that work, right? Like moving into tissue that is outside of the range of the immune system, moving into neurological tissue, for example, to hide from the immune system, is a strategy that many viruses use. And that means that they can be present and not detectable, right? Because they're shielded. It also puts the immune system in an interesting predicament, which is ordinarily the immune system's like the cartoon job that we describe in Introduction to Immunology is they distinguish self versus non-self, and they attack anything that looks biological that is non-self. Right. But that creates a selective force that drives pathogens in the direction of looking like self in order to hide from the immune system, which then raises the possibility of autoimmune disorder. And so it is, we heard
or to be, other in self's clothing. Right. To cloak themselves. Exactly.
But, and we heard from Pierre Corey when he was on the podcast that, in the case of COVID, right, the actual pathogen's presence may be short-lived relative to the disease, because a lot of the disease are the cascading inflammatory effects that continue on afterwards. And so all these things are on the table, and probably 20 others that, are harder to describe.
Yeah.
And here's what I think the punchline of all of this is. Long ago, 100 years ago, doctors were scientists. That's what they were. And they had a much smaller toolkit. But they were better at wielding it because their job was actually to spend enough time looking at patterns. And, I used to...
And people. Right. And spending time with their actual patients in their physical presence for longer, and often in their homes.
In their homes, exactly. And so the idea of a doctor who had a much smaller range of drugs they could prescribe, about which less was known, right? That doctor, nonetheless, had the ability to detect patterns. And there, there's this very famous example of cholera being discovered in a water source, in which the key piece of evidence was the geographic distribution of cases, right? But
if memory serves, I think that discovery was done by not one of the very local people. I think someone came in and basically started mapping it out.
I think that's true.
I can't remember. It's a very famous story. I just don't remember the specifics.
But how often is something like this the case, which you don't see when people come into your office? And, how often does the doctor look at your address and say, that's the fourth one of those cases I've seen from this neighborhood, and I haven't seen one from anywhere else. I wonder if there's arsenic in something.
Right. Or, I think more likely to be explanatory is... the doctor walks into the patient's home and wrinkles his nose.
Right.
Like, do you have mold? Or, oh, you've got 8 parakeets. Maybe you've got a bird allergy. Like whatever it is. Yep. Or, oh, you've got, how many times does that train that just rattled your windows go by? And you say you're sensitive to light and noise. There's just so many things that you can learn about what could actually be affecting someone's health by seeing them where they live. Obviously, this is the most obvious thing ever, right?
By seeing them where they live and being empowered. I think what people they can't fathom, right? We have this very, I think, foolish relationship with the idea of intuition, right? When people mention intuition, it's like they're treading right at the border of the mystical. Something mystical about this, right? Intuition is an unconscious process that is either well-informed or poorly informed by what the person has experienced, right? And so a person who has a lot of experience with something may have a very powerful intuition that that's the place to search, and that isn't. And they're likely to be right, not because something came from outside, but because they perceived accurately.
But this is super important, I think. I think the reason that many people think, oh, that's mystical, is because they have divided the world into 2 categories. That which is understandable by science and already understood, and everything else which is somehow mystical or woo, and depending on their particular predilections, either therefore none of that is real, or therefore we just don't know anything about it. And what you were saying, and we would argue, is intuition is you understanding something about the world that you don't yet have the words for. And it may be that actually science does have language for what it is that you've perceived and how it is that you've done it. And maybe science doesn't, but that doesn't mean just because science does or does not know yet what it is that you have done to get to the knowledge that you have, that it lives in some ethereal spirit world.
Right. It's the mistake of us categorizing the mind as synonymous effectively with the conscious mind, which is actually a tiny fraction of the mind, right? Even the thinking mind. There's lots of the mind that is dedicated to doing stuff that doesn't have anything to do really with thought. But there's a lot of thought that goes on outside of the realm of the consciously perceived. So, for example, let's say you knew somebody and, let's say they were basically honest, but they lied about some topic, right? And you might begin to pick up something. It might be that their vocal cords tense just slightly differently when they're in that lying phase.
People have a lot of tells.
Right, exactly. And so you may not know, if let's say that it is a frequency issue, that the tone color in their voice is just slightly
sonic
different.
Frequency.
Right,
yeah.
Right. Even if there was something in their voice, it might be that the only thing you could actually say consciously is there's something about their voice that's a little different, but you might not be able to say, no, there's less in this register, or
right.
Most of us don't even have the language for it. So the point is, a well-tutored intuition is actually the most important thing for somebody who knows a lot about a difficult topic, right? You really want them to use their well-tutored intuition to limit the search space. And the point is that doctors are being disempowered to be scientists, right?
Yes.
They're becoming practitioners of something that is algorithmic, right? When a person has these symptoms, they have this disorder, which is treated with this pharmaceutical. And the point is, it's a very automatic process. And we are now, in the context of COVID, watching it become even more automatic as doctors are being robbed of their ability, for example, to prescribe things off-label. But the point is, in a complex system,
yes,
you need somebody with an excellent intuition to come into your situation and to spot that although you have these symptoms which overlap the description of this disease, you also have this other thing which puts you in some separate, rarer category, perhaps. And you need somebody empowered to do that. And that's frightening because you can't tell whether somebody is capable of it based on their degree.
No,
right?
Certainly not.
It's a skill beyond what can actually be described and tested. Right. So, just like we talk sometimes in the context of science about somebody having lab hands. Right. Lab hands is like muscle memory. It doesn't really exist, but it's very important. The idea of a system that is going to rob doctors of their autonomy and their ability to navigate the unknown and say, medicine has figured out what we do with people, no matter what symptoms they walk through the door with. There's a checklist that we can go through that will tell you exactly what pill to send them out the door with. And the answer is no, that's never been good medicine. And it's especially bad now because we're dealing with such a large range of novel inputs and such an increased exposure to a variety of pathogens based on the way we travel around the world and all. So what you need
and the easiest way for medicine to make money is with pills.
Right. It's the easy thing, which is, this happened in psychology too, right? We went from people who, traversed the workings of the mind based on talking with them, which of course can't be systematized, right? To, here are the 6, any 3 of these 6 criteria mean you have such and such disorder, and here's the pill that fixes that, because of course we know so much about neurobiology that we can just drop a pill on it and fix you.
Because you've got bad genes for your teeth, that explains your teeth, and you've also got a serotonin deficiency or something.
Oh, you're not making enough serotonin. You're making too much serotonin. Yeah, it's
the same kind of absurd, reductionist, metric-driven, anti-scientific argument that passes for medicine or psychiatry or whatever it is passing for.
It is shoehorning the truly complex into these simple rubrics in order. It basically flatters your ability to fix stuff. And then, of course, those fixes don't really work, right? Like maybe you find some pill that has, arbitrary large effects across the brain. And of course, it disrupts whatever pathology you have going on, among other things. And
it may cause 3 others, but we've got pills for those too.
Right. We got pills for those too. And it may turn out that the effect isn't all that useful because it was just basically distracting. And then
or it's temporary, but addictive.
Right. So anyway, all of these things are the same damn error. And the answer is, human beings haven't gotten any simpler. And
So
the environment hasn't gotten any less noisy. So, we need people with really well-tutored intuition that comes from exposure to a wide range of examples, and they need to be free. That's the thing. In order to do the job well, they have to be free. And we're doing the opposite to them.